At the beginning of the story, we see a girl named Jane. Jane's childhood was filled with hardships. Her parents often had fights, and when Jane was 9 years old, her father took his own life on Christmas Day. Because of this incident, Jane started seeing life in a negative way from a young age and was completely shattered by her father's death. Even today, she has not been able to recover from that tragedy. Due to depression, Jane is admitted to a mental hospital, where many other people like her live for mental rehabilitation. But Jane keeps trying to end her life repeatedly. The doctors are treating her, but she has lost the will to live from within. Jane makes a plan to end her life on the upcoming Christmas Day, just like her father. So, one night, she secretly collects several pills in the mental hospital. When Christmas Day arrives, she takes a discharge from the hospital and goes to New York Airport to catch her flight home. At the airport, she meets a cheerful girl who is about to get married in a few days. She is very excited about her future, and she too is going to New York. After this, Jane meets another person named Paul. Paul is a kind and understanding man. Jane and Paul both had to travel on the same flight, but their flight was slightly delayed, so Paul tries to talk to her. However, Jane is sad and lost in deep thought. After some time, both board the flight, and coincidentally, their seats are next to each other. Seeing this, they are both surprised and a little happy. Then the flight takes off, and they talk to each other for a while. After some time, Paul falls asleep. During this time, Jane writes a note in which she mentions that Paul is the last person she spoke to, and she wishes him well for the rest of his life. She slips this note into Paul's pocket and then goes to the airplane's restroom. There, she takes out the pills she had stolen from the mental hospital and is just about to take them when the air hostess knocks on the door and asks Jane to come out quickly and fasten her seatbelt. Suddenly, the flight experiences a technical malfunction and the plane starts shaking violently. Passengers begin screaming in panic as the plane gets caught in a dangerous storm, and the pilot loses control of the aircraft. Meanwhile, Jane stays inside the restroom and doesn't try to come out. The plane starts descending rapidly, and within moments, it crashes into a snowy mountain. After some time, when Jane regains consciousness, she slowly steps out of the restroom. Blood is flowing from her head, and she sees that their plane has crashed in the icy mountains. It is nighttime, and she sees pieces of the plane scattered everywhere, with debris spread across the area. Jane sees the lifeless bodies of children, women, and men who lost their lives in this tragic accident. Seeing this, her heart fills with sorrow. Then she notices the girl who was about to get married on New Year's, but right in front of Jane's eyes, the girl takes her last breath. Just then, Jane hears someone's voice. She follows the sound and sees that Paul is trapped in the wreckage of the plane. Jane tries to pull him out. She tries to save him and succeeds. Paul tells her that to survive the cold, they must hide inside a large piece of the plane wreckage. Jane supports him and takes him inside a piece of the wreckage, where they try to protect themselves from the freezing wind and snow. At this moment, they realize that maybe they are the only two survivors left. Jane and Paul somehow spend the night in fear. The next morning, they come out of the wreckage and see snowy mountains all around them. There is no sign of any human or house, and the fog is so thick that they can't see far ahead. Jane walks over to the girl who had died right in front of her the previous night. She feels terrible for her. Paul tells Jane that the girl is gone and she can't come back. He says, "We survived this accident, we are lucky, and now we must move forward to find help. It's too cold here, and we don't have food. If we stay here too long, we will die of hunger." Paul believes that it is unlikely anyone will come for help, and even if someone does, they might not survive until then. So, he insists that they start walking as soon as possible. But Jane refuses to go with him and returns to the plane wreckage. Paul follows her and tells her again, "We have to leave or we will die here." But his words don't affect Jane because she no longer has the will to live. Paul makes one last attempt to convince her and says, "We need to support each other to survive and escape this place." Yet Jane still doesn't agree. Paul, realizing he can't change her mind, picks up his belongings and starts walking alone. Seeing him leave, Jane can't bear to let him go alone, so she starts following him. Paul is overjoyed to see Jane coming behind him, and they both continue their journey. They trek through snowy mountains in search of help. The journey is filled with countless difficulties, but they don't lose hope. When Jane gets exhausted, Paul encourages her to keep going. Despite having a stomach injury from the plane crash, Paul keeps moving forward. They support each other, battling freezing winds and pushing through the snow. The cold is so severe that even breathing becomes difficult, yet they continue step by step. While climbing down a rocky slope, they get trapped, Neither can they move forward, nor can they return the way they came. The path is treacherous, and Jane becomes terrified, but Paul encourages her. With no way out, Paul jumps down the cliff, managing to break his fall by grabbing onto a tree, avoiding severe injury. Seeing this, Jane also jumps down and luckily doesn't get seriously hurt either. After that, they keep moving forward, but they still don't see any signs of a forest or a house. They continue to struggle against heavy snowfall, extreme cold, and relentless hunger. They keep moving forward in the hope that someone will find them and save them. Paul and Jane continue their journey. When they get tired of walking, they rest for a while and then start walking again. By evening, their bodies begin to weaken from hunger and thirst. Just then, they see a small cave ahead, and Paul decides to stay there for the night. Jane, who is completely exhausted, is asked by Paul to come inside the cave, but before they can enter, a fierce snowstorm hits. Paul tells Jane to move aside, but both of them get caught in the storm. Paul doesn't get hurt much, but Jane gets buried under the snow. She tries to scream for help, but not a single word comes out of her mouth. Paul starts digging through the snow to find her, and finally, he discovers Jane unconscious. He picks her up and brings her inside the cave, taking care of her. After a while, Jane regains consciousness, and Paul feels overjoyed to see her awake. He tells her, "When I first saw you at the airport, I fell in love with you at first sight. That's why I changed my seat so I could sit next to you." At that moment, Paul notices Jane's medicine box and asks her about it. Jane then tells him her whole story, that when she was 9 years old, her father took his own life on Christmas Day. Since then, she had been living with depression. She reveals that she was planning to end her life on that very flight on Christmas. Hearing this, Paul gives her courage and tells her about his own life, how he lost his mother when he was a child and was left completely alone. But he never gave up and never thought of ending his life. He tells Jane, "We will definitely make it through this difficult time together." Paul's words spark a desire to live within Jane again. They stay in the cave that night and resume their journey the next morning. As they move forward, they face many obstacles, but somehow they manage to cross the snowy terrain. Now, they had to pass through the forest. They continue their journey, but Paul starts feeling intense pain from his stomach injury caused by the plane crash. He struggles to walk properly, but Jane encourages him, and they keep moving slowly. Paul, who already loved Jane, had been caring for her all these days. Seeing this, Jane started liking Paul too, and their bond grew stronger as they supported each other through every hardship. After walking for a while, Paul asks Jane to stop and goes ahead to check the path. He sees a river in the distance and, feeling overjoyed, calls Jane over. But as soon as Paul takes a step forward, his foot slips, and he falls down a slope, getting badly injured. His leg starts bleeding heavily. Jane immediately rushes to him, ties a cloth around his wound, and tries to stop the bleeding. Paul tells Jane, "Leave me and go ahead alone to find help." But Jane refuses to leave him behind in that condition. Paul tries to explain to her, "I can't go any further like this, and if I come with you, it will take too long. I want you to go alone so you can survive." Jane gives Paul some medicine, which reduces his pain a little. Then she supports him and slowly helps him move forward. They travel for a long time, and eventually evening falls. They spot a cave and decide to spend the night there. The next morning, they start walking again, but Paul's condition worsens. He starts vomiting blood, and his stomach wound becomes infected. His body grows extremely weak, and he collapses on the ground. Paul tells Jane, "I can't go any further. You should leave me here and keep going. If you find help, bring them back for me." Jane doesn't want to leave him, but she understands it's the only way. She tearfully tells Paul, "I've fallen in love with you, and I promise I'll save you." They both become very emotional, and then Jane sets out alone. After walking for a while, Jane finally reaches the forest. But there, she encounters a dangerous wild dog. The starving dog chases her and tries to attack. Jane runs as fast as she can and climbs up a tree. However, the dog refuses to leave and keeps trying to attack her. Jane tries to scare it away with a stick, but the dog remains aggressive. It suddenly jumps and bites Jane, injuring her. At that moment, Jane finds a sharp piece of glass in her pocket, the same glass she had kept to end her own life. She uses the glass shard to kill the dog and then, bleeding and wounded, continues her journey. She has no strength left, but the same Jane who once wanted to end her life now fights fiercely to survive, for herself and for Paul. She reaches the river Paul had seen earlier, washes herself, drinks water to quench her thirst, and regains a little strength. Then, she continues moving forward. After crossing the forest, Jane finally reaches a main road. She sees a car, but before she can signal for help, she collapses. The man in the car comes out, picks her up, and rushes her to the hospital. When Jane regains consciousness, the first thing she asks about is Paul. But before she can hear more, she faints again. The next day, when she wakes up, she sees her mother sitting beside her. Jane immediately asks about Paul, and her mother, with tears in her eyes, tells her that Paul died due to his injuries and starvation. Jane's mother hands her a letter that Paul wrote before he died. In the letter, Paul wrote, "Jane, no matter where you are, I will always be with you. Forget me and move forward. Start a new life." Reading the letter, Jane breaks down into tears. Paul had taught her how to live, but he was no longer there. However, before leaving, Paul gave Jane a new life. Friends, what do you think life would be like for Jane without Paul? Did Paul give her the true reason to live? Share your thoughts in the comment section. Like the video, share it, and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to press the bell icon so you never miss upcoming videos.